Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Physiology Made Easy with me, Dr. Amir Sandhu. Now in today's episode we're going to be talking about the conduction system of the heart and how electrical activity spreads from the sinoatrial node through the atria and into the ventricles via the apparatus of the cardiac conduction system. So let's get straight into it. Okay, so when we think about the conduction system of the heart, we've got to appreciate the wiring that we have, which allows electrical impulses to travel through different portions of the myocardial cells. Now, the most important thing to focus our attention here first is the yellow, of what we can see as the circuitry of the heart. So we've got the sinoatrial node, and this is known as the pacemaker of the heart. Okay, so it generates its own rhythm, and in fact, if we were to take a group of cells from the sinoatrial node, put them into a petri dish and make sure they're still alive, they would still carry on producing electrical activity. In fact, if we were to take our heart out of our rib cage and keep it alive and put it out on a desk in a lab, the heart would beat to around about 100 beats per minute. That is the intrinsic rhythm of the heart. Okay, so the sinoatrial node, specialized cardiac conduction cells that generate electrical activity. They also, before we talk about the ways that these connect, we need to think about more holistically what's happening in the conduction system. We've got the Atrioventricular Node, and that is responsible for sending the electrical activity to the left and the right bundle branches, and those we can see here. So those are known as the bundle of His, and we've got the left and the right bundle branches, and then they will go further into the heart tissue, into the very deep layers of the heart tissue, and are what we call Bikini Fibers. They're kind of terminal fibers are the Bikini Fibers, and they're embedded very deep in the deeper layers of the heart, like the endocardium. So the electrical activity is generated here. It's going to be spread to the AV node via what we call our internodal fibers. Okay, so we've got these internodal fibers here. We've got the middle fiber there, the anterior fiber there, and then we've got the posterior internode here. And essentially the idea of these nodes are to ensure that the signal from the sinoatrial node efficiently gets to the atrioventricular node. Okay, what we can also see here as well is the Bachmann's bundle. So we can just see it labeled here, the Bachmann's bundle, and essentially what that enables the impulse of the sinoatrial node to do is that once it's generated, it can then be transmitted across to the left side, to the left atrium, and that allows the simultaneous contraction of the atria. So remember, in any given cardiac cycle, the atria are contracting simultaneously and the ventricles are contracting simultaneously. Why do they contract? Because the electrical activity from this circuitry here provides the muscle fibers the stimulus in order for them to actually cause the contraction of the myocardium. So we've got the Bachmann's bundle, which allows that connection from the right to the left side on the atria, and then we've got these internodes here, the middle, the posterior and the anterior as well, and then from there we're going to go into the bundle of His to the left and right side and to the Bikini Fibers. Okay, so if we look more specifically at the structures, then so let's start with the sinoatrial node. So the sinoatrial node is the cell that actually sets the rhythm of the heart, or sets the rate at which the heart is actually going to beat. It's got the highest rate of depolarization, so this is the change in the membrane potential. So anybody that doesn't know about depolarization, it's important to just refer yourself to the textbooks describing how electrical signals are transmitted in between cells and in neurons. So SA node has the highest rate of depolarization. It's the pacemaker of heart. Its intrinsic rhythm is about 100 beats per minute. Now, what's important is that the sinoatrial node has innervation from our nervous system, Okay, so our sympathetic or our autonomic nervous system, our sympathetic and parasympathetic branches can directly innervate the sinoatrial node. And quite often, for example, when you're watching this video, listening to me, your heart rate is not going to be 100 beats per minute. It's because your autonomic nervous system, particularly the parasympathetic branch, is causing suppression of the signals that are generated in the sinoatrial node, and it's enabling your resting heart rate to be somewhere between 60 to 80 beats per minute, lower if you're an endurance trained athlete. So we have innervation from the autonomic nervous system. We also have endocrine impact on the sinoatrial node as well. So hormones can be released in the body. So we know about adrenaline, noradrenaline, and that can impact on the sinoatrial node as well. So various hormonal factors can influence the sinoatrial node as well as the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system. So essentially the cells in the sinoatrial node are generating the electrical impulse, and essentially what's going to happen is they're going to go through the internodal pathways, which we can see here, to the atrioventricular node. And that generation of the sinoatrial node signal to the AV node takes about 50 milliseconds. So for the electrical impulse to reach the SA node to the AV node, it takes around about 50 milliseconds. Then at the AV node, there is a delay of about 100 milliseconds. Okay, so the signal doesn't straight away go into the bundle of hairs. It stays in its place. The signal doesn't move forward for around about 100 milliseconds. The reason for that is to allow the atria to contract and force the blood into the ventricles. So this whole process needs to be coordinated. So when the sinoatrial node fires, it allows the atria to contract. The signal is held for 100 milliseconds at the AV node, and then once that period is passed, the signal then travels through the bundle branches. So it will go to the bundle branches, which we can again see here. We've got the left side and we've got the right side, and then we've got the Bikini fibers as well. Now, if I zoom into this image here, just bring it across the screen here, we can actually see that the left side of the bundle of hairs or the bundle branches is larger than the right side. Now the reason for that is the left side obviously has the left ventricle, which has got a larger muscle mass because it's pumping blood to the rest of the body. So it's going to have greater electrical innervation as well. So you have a larger muscle mass on the left side of the heart in the left ventricle. So the bundle of hairs or the bundle branches here are going to be larger, and there are going to be greater Bikini fibers present as well, as opposed to the right side. Now, what's important is, we go back to the slide here again, is that the right side does actually have direct innervation through what we call moderator bands to the papillary muscles. And if we remember back to the first video about the anatomy of the heart, the papillary muscles have the chordae tendineae attached to the valves, and they prevent the valves from kind of bulging backwards when the ventricles contract. So there is some direct connection on the right side via moderator bands to the papillary muscles to ensure that there's enough tension on the chordae tendineae to prevent the valves, the atrioventricular valve from going backwards. So the signal gets to the Bikini fibers, and then essentially what happens is the impulse, as we can see, we're probably at stage 5 now, so the impulse has traveled through the bundle branches. It's now going deep into the myocardium and to the subendocardium and to the endocardium, which are the layers of the heart. So the electrical activity has really penetrated deep into the muscular layers of the heart, and we're now going to get a contraction. So the ventricles are now going to contract. They're going to force blood, if it's the right side, into the pulmonary circuit, and if it's the left side, into the systemic circuit, to the blood vessels, to the rest of the body. Okay, so that's essentially how the sinoatrial node initiates the electrical activity of the heart. Okay, so when we think a little bit more about the atrioventricular node and what it does, it's important to understand how this node actually works, because it's got a very important function in terms of holding that signal. So the first thing to highlight is, like the sinoatrial node, this is also a group of specialized myocardial cells, and they're located within the atrioventricular septum. Okay, so that division between the atria and the ventricle. So they basically that septum prevents the signal that's generated by the sinoatrial node just to randomly go to the ventricle muscles, okay? So by having the node located by the septum, which actually contains some connective tissue and that blocks the electrical submission, it means that only electrical activity that's generated from the SA node can pass through the AV node. It can't go through the muscles, okay? Because generally when electrical activity is generated, it can spread from cell to cell as well, so it can spread from one muscle cell to another muscle cell, but by having the atrioventricular septum, you're preventing cell to cell transmission of the electrical impulse, so the signal from the SA node can only go to the AV node and then be passed on from the AV node only to the left and the right bundle branches. So there is a 100 millisecond delay when the signal gets to the atrioventricular node, and that's generally because the cells, the electrical cells within the AV node have a much smaller diameter, okay? So they have a smaller cell diameter and basically they just reduce the efficiency in which the electrical signal can move across. So they get to the AV node, smaller cell diameter, that slows down the signal somewhat to 100 milliseconds, but then after that the AV node will fire and it will send the electrical signal towards the bundle of hairs and the left and the right side and the Bikini fibers, and you get ventricular contraction. And it's interesting that the AV node, when it's maximally stimulated by the sinoatrial node, it can stimulate or send electrical signals about 220 times per minute. And 220 is around about the maximum heart rate in a very young, healthy individual. As we get older with each decade, that does start to reduce, and one of the ways to work out your maximum heart rate actually is to take this value here, 220, which is the maximum that this will actually fire, and subtract the age that you're currently at, and that will give you a relative estimate of your maximum heart rate. So that's how the atrioventricular node is actually working. Okay, so staying with the same circuitry then, so from the atrioventricular node, the electrical signal is going to travel to the atrioventricular bundle, to the bundle branches, and then eventually to the Bikini fibers. Now, again, the left bundle is typically larger than the right, and as I've explained earlier, that's simply because you've got the left ventricular mass, which is greater than the right side. And then, as I said before as well, we've got moderator bands, which directly stimulate those papillary muscles, and essentially you've got increased tension on the chordae tendineae just before the ventricular contraction, and when the ventricular contraction happens, the valves that we've got here, when they close shut, the force of the blood will prevent them from bulging backwards, okay, or bulging upwards. So that's what's happening with the atrioventricular apparatus. So then we move to almost the end of the electrical circuitry of the heart, and that's these Bikini fibers that we've got here, okay? So they contract very quickly, so they have a 75 millisecond contraction speed, so once the electrical signal gets here, it's going to spread very rapidly, you know, as we can see here as well, it's going to spread very rapidly to all of the myocardial cells and the subendocardium and endocardium as well. Now, related to the heart layers, so this diagram here, what we can see here is the myocardium. This is the kind of muscular layer of the heart, lots of cardiomyocytes here that are involved in the contraction of the ventricles and the atria. But we've also then got a subendocardium, so it's almost like a layer that's going deeper into the part where the blood is contained. And then we've got the endocardium. So this is the part which is lined by the endothelial cells and is the part that's in contact with the blood. So if you think about what we can see here, around the outside would have the myocardium, then we'd have the subendocardium, and the part that's in contact with the blood, this is the endocardium, that inner layer of the muscular wall of the heart, okay, and that's the endocardium. And the Bikini fibers are embedding the myocardium, but all the way through to the endocardium. So the electrical impulse that was generated from the sinoatrial node is now traveling through all of these cells and going deep into the deep layers of the heart via the Bikini fibers, okay? So the Bikini fibers are incredibly important to be working correctly, and essentially when the signal has traveled to what we call the apex of the heart, Okay, so when it travels to the apex of the heart, which we can see in the bottom of this image here, the electrical signal will trigger the cardiomyocytes to contract, and then we get this contraction from what I call the bottom upwards. Okay, so you get the contraction at the apex first, and then from there you'll get the ventricles contracting. Okay, and then once the ventricles contract, they force that blood through either the aorta to the rest of the body or to the pulmonary artery into the lungs. And we can see it's like squeezing a tube of toothpaste. Okay, so if you're squeezing from the bottom, you're forcing that blood upwards towards the base of the heart where we've got the great vessels. So although the impulse is generated there, the great electrical activity in terms of forcing the blood to the rest of the body or to the lungs is actually generated at the apex. So it's those Bikini fibers that are rapidly discharging, and then they're causing that contraction at the apex, ventricles are contracting, and then we're getting blood to the rest of the body. And of course, before that signal travels and gets to that point, the activity of the sinoatrial node has already triggered the atria to contract via the Bachmann's bundle and the internodal pathways as well, so that moves through the atria as well. So there you have it, a very simplified overview of the cardiac conduction system. Please do stay tuned for more videos coming soon.